Good morning, everyone. We are excited to have you here. This first speaker, she's actually speaking twice on two different topics. She flew all the way from New York and is joining us. Bojana, and I'm not going to say her last name. I can say the Weatherly bit, but is an award-winning physician, board-certified integrative medicine. She's trained in functional medicine, nutrition, and mindfulness, and her approach is rooted in evidence-based medicine that is personalized to each individual she works with. Throughout her academic career, she's performed research in endocrinology and oncology and published many peer-reviewed journals, presented at academic conferences, and she's the recipient of many honors and awards. She's also established herself as a speaker and an educator, teaching medical students and residents and speaking on the health topics in academic and corporate settings, as well as wellness events, such as this one. She's shared her medical expertise on a number of TV shows, and we're really excited to have her here. She has 2 young children and her husband, and they enjoy nature and experimenting in the kitchen and doing all sorts of things. So we're really excited to have her here. It's the first time she is speaking at LiveAware, but she does have 2 talks, one right now and then one later today, and we're excited. So thank you, Bojana, for coming.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. How's everyone doing this morning? It's such a beautiful sunny day. So, all right. So let's go ahead and start. So today we're going to talk about how to reduce your own and your family's toxin exposure and risk of chronic disease. And we're going to talk about a number of different topics. But let me just start by asking you a few questions. How many of you think that you're exposed to environmental toxins on a daily basis? Good, yeah. And how many of you believe that stress also contributes to chronic disease and is a form of toxin? And how many of you believe that leading a healthy, cleaner lifestyle where we can clean up some of these toxins can reduce your risk of chronic disease? Great, so you're in the right place and you're not alone. And you're absolutely right. So let me share with you a little bit about the road that led me to integrative and functional medicine, but also really looking at all of our exposures rather than focusing necessarily on disease and disease management, but really looking at the big picture of all of the different triggers that are known to us that potentially could be implicated in development of chronic disease and what we might want to do about that. So, I'm sharing here the picture of this road because, as you can imagine, in life, most of our roads, how many of you had, whether your personal or career planned out and everything kind of worked out as this linear road and then you saw the sun at the end of it and that was it, right? Nobody. So my road, very much like that, was this kind of windy road where there were shadows and twists and turns and I had no idea what was around the corner. But I followed what seemed to be partly intuitive, but partly also scientifically based and something that I was really concerned about. So I'll share 2 critical points that I had that really shaped my view of this topic ultimately and my view of healthcare and my approach to patients. So the first one was in my residency training. I was an internal medicine resident. I was running around taking care of very sick patients. And by the way, I also decided to have 2 children during residency. And as you can imagine, that introduced a lot of stress in my life and a lot of management of different things, from my very sick patients that I was working very hard to help treat and that I absolutely love doing, to taking care of these babies that were growing inside of me and not really benefiting from many healthy lifestyle habits that I had at that time. So I reached this critical point where the stressors and the burnout and everything accumulated one night where I woke up in the middle of the night and I was really kind of at a low point, very sort of desperate and wondering, what am I doing? Are all these habits that I now have and the lack of sleep and the stress, how are they contributing to my growing baby? And so what I did, as any other kind of scientific nerd, went online, went on PubMed, which is a scientific database, and started looking at the correlations between shift work, stress, premature labor, other complications of pregnancies. And there was a lot of data on this. And in that moment, there were two ways that I could go. One was I could say, I'm a victim, I'm giving up, this is all backwards, or I could take a proactive approach to my own healthcare, which is thankfully what I did. So I started working with integrative medicine practitioners, including a chiropractor, an acupuncturist, a prenatal yoga instructor, a doula, to do everything I possibly could to shield my environment, to protect my environment and the environment of the baby in the setting of what I was doing professionally at the time. And despite my babies measuring very large and the threat of a possible C-section, thankfully through these modalities, I was able to thankfully give birth to these amazing little human beings. So that was that first critical point of realizing that, you know what, our body has the ability to heal if we just support it, if we prime it. And we all can do this in various ways. And so then I started practicing medicine a couple of years later, and that was my second critical point. I was seeing a lot of patients with chronic disease, with unexplained symptoms of chronic fatigue, joint aches, depression, anxiety, insomnia, who were either given medications by our conventional system, but were still not getting better, or felt that they were told, there's nothing wrong with you, there's nothing we can do. There's nothing wrong with you. It's in your head. And this really got me curious because clearly there was something wrong, but we just weren't able to detect it. We weren't able to figure it out. And so this is when I really started to focus more on the lifestyle habits of my patients and really working with them to figure out what's at the root of all of these problems. And so slowly, patients that were following some of these lifestyle transformations were starting to get better. So I felt like, okay, I'm onto something, I'm doing something right here. And by the way, by this time, I still had no knowledge of environmental exposures to toxins and all of the implications. And then at one event, I met Ken Cook, who's the co-founder and president of the Environmental Working Group. How many of you guys are familiar with the EWG? Okay, perfect. And that evening completely just opened up a whole new door to me because I really have to say it's looking at environmental toxins, understanding the implications for our health, analyzing the studies that have been done, whether it's in cell lines, animal studies, or humans, was never part of any sort of training that I had. And so this was a whole new territory for me that, again, added on this other element to my practice. So I just want to briefly share some of these foundational principles of health and healing. And today we'll be focusing on our nature, our exposures, toxin reduction. And then within that toxin reduction, we'll talk a little bit about the stress reduction piece as well as a form of toxin. So what does our roadmap for today look like? We'll talk about sources of environmental toxins, who's affected. And I have a spoiler alert here, we all are, but especially children who are most vulnerable. And then we'll talk about each source of toxin exposure. So when or how might we be exposed? What specific toxins are we exposed to from each source? And of course, it's impossible to go through all of them, but I'll talk about some of the key ones that have been studied and provide some references for those. What impact do these toxins have on our physiology? And then how does this translate to adverse health effects? And then what can we do to avoid or minimize toxins? And then I'll share with you some take-home points in a cheat sheet. So who is affected? Or the sources first. So food. We're going to talk about processed food, including food additives, pesticides that are in our food packaging as well, actually, water, plastics, personal care products that are filled with toxins, household products, furniture and flame retardants, EMFs, which is the subject of my talk later today, so I'm not going to spend too much time, and then stress. And then just a brief note that I wanted to make you aware of course, there are occupational exposures to individuals that may be exposed to some toxins at higher doses than the normal population. This is really, really important to address on an individual basis, but just so you know, this is not the scope of today's talk, but it is something that's really important. So who's affected? So we're all affected. This is something that's actually been called the silent pandemic by public health researchers. And it's really something that, sometimes I think that we have a tendency, if we don't yet have any symptoms or haven't developed a chronic disease, it feels like these toxins are kind of out there somewhere, right? However, not only are the toxins around us, but they're actually inside of us, which we'll talk about as well. And I'll just share with you a few facts. So the Center for Disease Control found that there are 265 environmental chemicals in human blood and urine, and this was part of a large national survey called the NHANES study. And they found that in individuals 12 years old or older, over 99% of these individuals that were part of this survey, they have PFAS in blood, and we'll talk a little bit about PFAS and what are the sources of it and what it does. And they found that over 96% of Americans have BPA in their bodies, which is an endocrine disruptor and has been linked with reproductive disorders. They've also found that pesticide metabolites are highest in children 6 to 11 years old. So our children have the highest concentration of these pesticide metabolites that they're going to be growing up with, that are going to be shaping their growth and development. On the other hand, is anybody familiar with the Halifax Project? It's a study looking at potential carcinogens and their mechanism of action in terms of causing cancer. So how they're basically mechanistically involved in our cellular pathways to cause cancer. So they investigated 85 potential carcinogens, and a subsequent study found that 23 out of these 85 potential carcinogens are found in our blood. And lastly, I'll share that the Environmental Working Group also found 278 contaminants in our drinking water across all states between 2012 and 2017, but we'll talk about water a little bit later. So let's talk about the study of 10 Americans by the Environmental Working Group. So this was a study that was done where a sample was collected from each of these 10 individuals, lab analyzed for 413 chemicals, and these are toxic chemicals that are present in the air. However, none of these Americans were exposed to air. None of them were exposed to water, where these chemicals might also reside. None of them were drinking water or eating food directly. And none of them were using personal care products. And yet they found 287 chemicals in these 10 humans. So can you guess what these 10 humans might be? So they're fetuses. So we thought for a long time that there's no transfer from mom to fetus of these chemicals, but clearly the study shows that there are. So what were some of these products? Some of them 28 were waste products. 47 were consumer product ingredients, such as flame retardants, Teflon, pesticides. And 212 industrial chemicals and pesticides breakdown products that were actually banned over 30 years ago. So a lot of these pollutants, a lot of these chemicals can persist in our environment for a very long time. So these chemicals that were found in the cord blood of these fetuses, what implications do they have for our health? Well, 134 of them have been found to cause cancer in animals and humans. 151 are associated with birth defects. 154 associated with hormone disruption. 186 associated with infertility. And 130 immune system toxicants. And not to mention the neurotoxins, including lead, PCB, and mercury. Many of these chemicals have multiple toxic effects, and they also act synergistically. So in studies, oftentimes one specific toxin is studied, but in the real world, although we may be exposed to very small doses, we're exposed to hundreds of these chemicals, clearly, and we still don't know enough about how do they all act synergistically. So let's start with food. I'll just share a brief story of how I grew up in my relationship to food. So I grew up in Serbia, and I remember going with my grandmother to a piazza, and a piazza is a Serbian farmer's market, where these farmers would come from the nearby villages into my town every single day, proudly bringing their amazing organic products that actually tasted real. I mean, do you remember how tomatoes used to taste and peaches before they kind of started tasting very plasticky and like no smell, nothing? So that is what I was used to growing up. And so I moved to North America in the mid-90s, and this is what I saw. And now, of course, this is everywhere. It's not just in North America. So this is what food looks like now, right? So we went from this to this. And so initially, it's funny though, because I thought, oh my gosh, there's so much abundance. There are all these things and they taste so great, right? But this is really scarcity in disguise. It's nutrient scarcity, and these products are filled with a number of different toxins that we'll talk a little bit about. So what are some of the basic principles and ways in which we can protect ourselves? Well, we should eat a whole food, plant-rich diet that is organic, or at the very least, mostly organic. And we'll talk about why. And then there's another principle that I actually heard from a physician in Sardinia, who's the doctor to the centenarians in a blue zone. Do you guys know what a blue zone is? So there are 5 blue zones in the world. One of them happens to be in Sardinia. And they're places where there are highest densities of centenarians who live not only longer lives than the average, but healthier lives. They're functional. They're enjoying life. And so this doctor said one of his pieces of advice was eat a 0-kilometer diet. So eat things in season and things that grow around where you are. Aim for organic, non-GMO products. And if you can't buy all organic food, you can always consult with the Dirty Dozen and Clean 15 lists that are provided by the EWG, and they're renewed on an annual basis, depending on the density and amount of pesticides in these different fruits and vegetables. And so why is this important? I'm just going to talk about a couple of studies, but a French study that came out a couple of years ago, which was a large study with almost 70,000 participants, found that those who had more organic food consumption had less cancer. And this study looked at breast, colorectal, prostate, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and skin cancer. So what about glyphosate? There's a lot of, are you guys familiar with glyphosate? Yes. So glyphosate, we know, is present, is an herbicide, and it's used for GMO soy and corn, as well as a drying agent for oats to help them get harvested faster. But what we know about glyphosate is that it makes its way into breakfast cereals. And who consumes breakfast cereals? Children. So what else do we know about glyphosate? Well, it's actually been classified as a possible carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Possible carcinogen. And there have been multiple studies linking it with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Mechanistically, we know that it causes oxidative stress and can cause DNA damage. It also has antibiotic properties, so may kill our gut bacteria, but bacteria can also develop resistance to it, so it can be contributing to some antibiotic resistance as well. And let me just share with you a story, because once I learned about glyphosate and really kind of started looking into it, it reminded me of the patients that I had seen with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma over the years. And oftentimes, we don't know what the cause is. And we think that it's, spontaneous mutations, or for some reason they had a predisposition. But it just reminds me of, how many of their diagnoses or deaths after long treatment rounds and hospitalizations could have been prevented if we had just taken glyphosate out of the equation. Another alarming study shows us that children who are exposed to pesticides at home, either before, during the time of birth, or shortly after, are up to 2 times more likely to get leukemia, 2 different forms of leukemia, ALL or AML. So we definitely know that pesticides are an issue, and it's something that we need to be cognizant of and try to reduce exposure to. So now what about the toxins in our food? How do they affect our gut health, right? I see a lot of patients that come with gut health problems, with a lot of food sensitivities, autoimmune issues. And so this is one thing that might be a little bit more subtle, where we may not necessarily make the connection with the gut, with exposure to toxins, but it's present. So a study actually found that glucose, salt, emulsifiers used in food, organic solvents, gluten, nanoparticles that are all used by the food industry can compromise the integrity of tight junctions in the intestine. And we'll talk about what these look like and why they're important. But essentially, the impairment of the tight junctions in the wall of our intestine is common in a number of autoimmune diseases. And once this barrier function is destroyed, entry of foreign toxins and foreign substances that can activate our immune system occurs. So what happens here is that, let me see if you see this pointer, perfect. So this is what this is a very simplified representation of what a normal layer of these gut cells may look like, right? And you see how they're very close together, and there are these normal tight junctions that are very selectively permeable to toxins that might come through from, here is the lumen, or the kind of the hollow tube inside the intestine right here, and then this is our blood. And so normally this cell layer is very, very selective when it comes to what gets into our blood. However, when we have inflammation, when we have exposure to these toxins that are coming from food, from pesticides, and so on, what happens is over time, there's this compromise in these tight junctions. And now the picture doesn't look so beautiful and so regular, but we're seeing that potential toxins, so these could be infectious agents, these could be bacteria, these could be toxins from food, these could be pesticides. I mean, any contaminants really that you could think of potentially could then permeate through and start activating our gut-associated lymphoid tissue, which is our gut-associated immune system, and then as a result cause a cascade of reactions that causes inflammation in our body. And so this is what's known as a leaky gut, or increased intestinal permeability. And this is just that same study showing that these food additives and processed food can break this gut barrier, allowing the entry of toxins and then stimulation of the immune system. And this study also actually shows that there's an increase in autoimmunity along with increase in food additives as well. Again, it doesn't necessarily support, and it can't prove a causal relationship, but it's something that we see are on the rise together, and we have to be mindful of that correlation. So now we've talked about food. What about food packaging itself? So plastic containers. So this is, again, something that I used to use all the time before becoming really more aware of some of the side effects and potential health hazards. So it's just so easy, right, to have our plastic food containers, whether we take food to work, whether we're just on the go. It's so convenient. But it's really, really important to avoid plastic containers and utensils. And one of the reasons is that they contain BPA. So what do we know about BPA? Well, it's used to make plastics, plastic dinnerware, also, by the way, toys and lining of food cans. And it's also present in receipts, actually. So it leaches from food and beverage containers. It leaches into our food and therefore goes into our system. And it also is found to pass into placenta and breast milk. It has weak estrogen activity, so weak hormonal activity, even at very low doses. and it has reproductive and neurodevelopmental effects and can trigger inflammation. And there is a possible correlation with cancer. It's found that it inhibits regulation of cell division and can cause DNA damage. The good news is that it doesn't accumulate. Unlike some substances that can bioaccumulate for a very long time, it doesn't, and it's excreted in the urine within a day. So it is something that we can eliminate from our exposures. But it's also not enough to buy a bottle that's labeled BPA-free, because unfortunately, almost all commercial available plastic products that were sampled in this study in 2011 that were BPA-free, they leached chemicals having detectable estrogenic activity. So these replacements for BPA could be just as bad, if not worse. So what do we do instead? Well, we can use glass, we can use stainless steel instead. So I also mentioned this, the BPA line cans, right? So we want to look for the BPA-free label. And we definitely, want to look for brand. There are certain brands that are BPA-free, like Eden, for example. That's one of the brands where I get my beans and my chickpeas. They have no BPA lining. And actually the beans are pre-soaked as well. And then what about our non-stick cookware, right? So we're moving on to another environmental toxin called PFAS. So it's present in non-stick cookware, but it's present in a lot of other places as well. So again, what we can do to prevent that, stainless steel and iron cast cookware. So what about PFAS? Well, exposure is linked to cancer, liver toxicity, obesity, immune suppression, and thyroid hormone abnormalities. And blood levels of PFAS in individuals in the US are actually up to 30 times greater than individuals in some of the other countries. And PFAS is also found in drinking water, which we're going to talk about. So ideally, we may, sometimes choose to drink bottled water because we think, well, it's cleaner, it's more filtered, it's better. However, the regulations on bottled water are actually kind of pretty loose in that manufacturers don't actually have to report contaminants in bottled water. And so as long as tap water is safe, drinking filtered tap water is the best way to go. And there are some resources on EWG's website as far as the tap water database, where they're actually reporting any possible contaminants, but also there's a water filter guide to determine what's the appropriate water filter to get for your home. The other thing about bottled waters is that it actually takes up to 2,000 times more energy to produce bottled water than it does tap water. So that's another reason. And then, of course, the issue of plastics, right? Plastics accumulate. So most bottled water is in plastic bottles. And so the issue is that these microplastics are damaging to our entire environment, but also to our health. And they also actually tend to bioaccumulate. So this is something that we're getting from seafood, but we can also just get it for dust. And these microplastics can also be vehicles for BPA entry. So instead, we want to use glass, water bottles, stainless steel. So now we move on to personal care products. And again, it's impossible to go through all of the toxins, but I'll really just talk about some of them. And I'm sure by now you've caught on to the pattern that a lot of these toxins are present in a lot of different things. It's like, oh, it's in toys, but it's also in our food and it's also in our personal care products. So just a few examples here. So in our eye makeup, we may encounter PFAS. Red lipstick can often be contaminated with lead. Our skincare products, PFAS and parabens. Parabens are used as a preservative. And then fragrance. How often on the ingredients list do you see fragrance? Well, fragrance we have no idea what's in fragrance. And the manufacturers don't have to disclose. So that's always a red flag. So let's just focus on a couple of them. So lead is a nervous system toxin, and there's no safe level of lead. And it can contaminate the mineral pigments that colors lipstick, especially red lipstick. And actually back in the 18th century, when people wore red lipstick and the white lead makeup, people used to get lead poisoning quite a bit as a result of that. And cosmetic companies don't have to disclose this. So try to stay away from red lipstick, everyone. So what about parabens? As I mentioned, they're used as preservatives in cosmetics and personal care products. So they might be found in shampoos, facial and skin cleansers, hair and shaving products, and lotions. They're also added in baked goods to prevent spoilage, and they're added to beverages, jellies, syrups, and so on, as well as food packaging that we mentioned. So they have this weak estrogenic activity, and they can also get absorbed through the skin, right? So as you're applying your cream, it could be absorbed through the skin. So the bad news is that parabens can also cause skin reactions, allergies. They can increase chromosomal abnormalities in lab studies. The good news is that they also don't accumulate in skin or organs. So this is something that we can phase out. And parabens have been found in 96 to 99% of urine specimens. So what are some of the other concerns? So parabens were found to be higher in women who are overweight or obese. So there may be a linkage there with their metabolism. Parabens are associated with hormones that promote obesity, and they negatively affect metabolic health. They're also found in human breast tissue. Again, it's not something that we can conclusively say there's a causal relationship, but it's an association that is important to look into further. And then some authors also conclude that there's insufficient data for any serious health effects of paraben use, but there's certainly enough data to say that this is something that we should be concerned about and investigate further. So with a lot of these toxins, when you look at the literature, there are some negative studies, there are some positive studies, but there are enough positive studies to raise concern and enough associations to raise concern that we need to do more research before this is just widely present for all of us. Oh, oops. So what about, so how do we choose clean products, right? So we want to look for these known toxic ingredients and avoid products that contain them. So for example, parabens we talked about, but it's impossible to look at every single ingredient and then look it up and do research on it, right? That's just not practical. So this is why I myself use the Healthy Living app by the Environmental Working Group, and it's just an easy way to scan the barcode, to enter your product. They have a huge database of products, and you can find their rating, the level of research, when determining their safety. And also, just because a product claims to be all natural, it doesn't actually mean anything as far as toxins. And then, as I mentioned, fragrance is a red flag. So we don't know what's in it. Fragrance could include some of the toxic ingredients, and so best to avoid products that list fragrance as on their list of ingredients. So now, what about household cleaning products? Well, there's a study that came out not long ago, actually, that found that among women who were either cleaning at home or who were cleaning as an occupation, their lung function is impaired 10 to 20 years after starting cleaning activities. And this was found to be equivalent to 10 to 20 pack years of smoking. And women who clean were diagnosed with asthma more often than women who do not clean at home or occupationally. So this particular study didn't look at the specific ingredients in each cleaning product. So this was just a large study looking at reports of cleaning and household product use. Generally, what I recommend is, again, Environmental Working Group has a wonderful cleaning guide as well to, again, try to identify products that are less harmful to health. But also, I wanted to point out that more brands are realizing now, and I'm sure you've seen more and more brands coming into the market, but also some of the older ones that are realizing that consumers are asking for information, they're asking for quality, they're asking for less toxic products. So more and more are responding to this with more transparency in their ingredient lists, but also using safer ingredients. So what about furniture? Well, we know that flame retardants are everywhere, right? Baby blankets, mattresses, and carpets. But we also know that We can get them from dust or even food. I mean, they're just kind of everywhere in the environment. They're not just in the blankets or in the furniture. And what's concerning about flame retardants is that they have been implicated in cancer, but also interfere with reproductive systems and neurological development as well. And of course, infants and children are most affected. So now EMFs. So this is going to be the topic of my talk this afternoon, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Just please never put a cell phone that close to a baby. So EMFs have been classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as possibly carcinogenic. Cell phone radiation may be linked to breast cancer, and we heard about this last night, and I'm going to talk more about it this afternoon. So we really, really, really have to be mindful about EMF. It's not possible to completely eliminate this from our environment, but it is possible to reduce the exposure from our own devices and from our homes. And then just some very simple ways in which we can minimize the exposure. So using a wired headset, texting more and talking less so that our phones or iPads are farther away from us. Store the phone away from you, especially at night. Don't put it in the pocket. Keep it, again, as far away as possible from the body. Airplane mode at night. When it comes to screens, using a blue light filter. And then just avoiding electronics at night in general. Again, this is just a very basic list as to how we can begin to think about reducing our EMF exposure. So now what about chronic stress, our last toxin that we're going to discuss today? So we can eat the cleanest food, reduce our exposure to toxic chemicals in the environment. We can reduce our EMF exposure. But if we're chronically stressed, we're still going to experience a lot of the adverse health effects of that. So it's really important to pay attention to this and really treat it as a toxin, because it is. And so this is just a quote that I like. Health is a state of body and wellness is a state of being, right? So yes, we have to do all of the things on the checklist to keep our body healthy, but we also have to pay attention to being. And we're going to talk about mindfulness and being in the present moment. But now let's look at some statistics. So this is from the American Psychological Association, and it essentially did these surveys where they looked at what is the rating of stress for different populations. So millennials are a very stressed out group of people, rating 5.7 out of 10. Gen X also 5.3, and baby boomers seem to be the least stressed in those groups. Many people are stressed about the future of our nation, about money, about work, about healthcare, and about the economy. What are some of the symptoms of stress? Anxiety or feeling nervous, anger or irritability, fatigue, right? That chronic fatigue, stress can definitely be a significant contributor to that. What about stress in the workplace? This is actually a study from the UK, but it just shows the prevalence of stress that people deal with in the workplace. And of course, where do we spend most of our time if we're working adults? At work. So what about anxiety and depression that can certainly be significantly influenced by stress? So nearly a third of US adults experience anxiety, and I would say based on my clinical experience, even more than that. Greater than 1 in 5 US adults experience mood disorder, such as depression. And stress accounts for 75 to 90% of all doctors' visits. 75 to 90%. Stress is in some way related to that. That's a huge, huge proportion. And stress can also affect intestinal permeability. So we talked about the leaky gut, right? And all of these toxins permeating through, stimulating our immune system. Well, chronic stress has also been found to impair the lining of our gut in an animal model, in a rat model, actually. And another interesting but sad fact is that stress can also affect our gut microbiome, our gut bacteria, which is not the topic of this talk today, but it's a fascinating topic that's, again, very much related to a lot of the different aspects of what we talked about today. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to offer a couple of techniques that we can all use, and one of them we can do together right now in terms of changing the way that we channel and process stress. So one thing that we can do are breathing exercises. So breathing exercises have been found to reduce anxiety and also reduce the use of anxiety medications. And in the clinical setting, I'm happy to say that I've been able to help people either reduce or completely eliminate use of anti-anxiety medications that can potentially be addictive just by teaching them some simple breathing techniques. Yoga also has been found to help reduce anxiety, increase resiliency to stress, and it also improves insomnia. So let's do a very basic breathing technique that was taught at a seminar a while ago by Dr. Andrew Weil. So it's called the 4-7-8 breathing technique. It helps to calm our nervous system. It helps actually reduce our heart rate and blood pressure, and it can help with insomnia. So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to inhale for 4. We're going to hold our breath for 7. And then we're going to exhale for 8. And the absolute time of these 3 things is not as important as just keeping the ratio. So if you want, you can count inside your head, or you can count with me. I'm just going to be using my fingers to count here. I'm going to demo 1 breath, and then we're going to do 3 breaths together. All right, so this is what it's going to look like. And also just pay attention that when you exhale, you'll see that I'm gonna be keeping my tongue just behind my front upper teeth, and as I exhale, it'll be kind of like a whooshing sound. So you want to exhale through your mouth. So it's going to look like this. All right, ready to do it together? All right, so on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. And our second breath. And our third. Good. How do you feel? Good. I see some nods and smiles. Good. Sleepy. Yeah. So yeah, sometimes it might cause this kind of wave of calm. Sometimes it could cause a little bit of dizziness. Sometimes it can energize. It really depends. But it is the kind of breathing that you may want to do a couple of times a day. You can do 4 breaths each time. And you can also do it in situations of stress, agitation, anxiety. You get an angry email and you want to respond, don't respond. Do the breathing technique first. Or even if you feel a panic attack coming on, this is also where I find it very effective. As long as you don't let it get to a point. If you do it early enough, it can actually help prevent a panic attack. So what about mindfulness? So in addition to doing these breathing techniques and really being aware of our breath, right, and aware that we're not doing our kind of shallow, rapid breathing and our fight or flight response, but slow and deep breathing, what else can we do to enhance and to optimize our response to day-to-day stressors, right? Because we can't, just like with environmental toxins, we can't magically have them disappear, but we can change our relationship to them. We can change our interaction with them and how they affect us. So what is mindfulness? So I'm going to share a definition that was proposed by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction. So it's about being fully awake. It is awareness to the present moment that's cultivated on purpose by paying attention. So we're paying attention mindfully or on purpose and without judging, right? And our instinct is to judge, right? Our instinct is to evaluate the situation and to evaluate what we're presented with and judge. That can be a great thing, and that's wonderful to be aware of that. But in being mindful, we're just separating ourselves a little bit about that judgment. Or a judgment could come in the form of negative self-talk, right? How many of you have negative self-talk occasionally? I'm not good enough. I could do better. I could do this, right? Most of us, right? So this is a way to kind of just separate, not resist. It's very gentle. It's really just paying attention to what's coming up, being curious about it, and looking at it as an observer as much as possible. Of course, this is very, very difficult in extreme situations of stress. So this is why it's important to cultivate this practice when we're not in that extreme stress, so that we could at least get a little bit closer to it when we are, and it can protect us a little bit. And I'm just going to share some of the studies. There are so many studies on mindfulness and mental and physical health. I'm just going to share a few. So there was a meta-analysis that was done, which is basically an analysis of a number of different studies, in this case, randomized controlled trials. And randomized controlled trials are when we have a group of people and we randomize them to either the intervention, which in this case was mindfulness meditation, versus control, where they're not getting that intervention. But it was found in this study from Johns Hopkins that the mindfulness meditation group had improved anxiety, depression, and pain. Now, what about mindfulness and sleep? So it was found that in this study that the mindfulness group had better outcomes in terms of improving sleep quality, symptoms of insomnia, and then depression and fatigue that can follow from insomnia, compared to the group that was instructed on sleep hygiene. And sleep hygiene is just a number of practices that are very important to kind of set the stage for sleep. What about longevity? So this is a study that was done on mindfulness and telomeres, which are these caps at the ends of our chromosomes. And their length decreases normally over time as a function of cell division and as a function of an enzyme called telomerase. Shortened telomeres and reduced telomerase activity are predictors of a number of health risks and diseases. So you can imagine if we have high telomerase activity and longer telomeres, it's a prediction of better health and cellular longevity as well. So this study looked at participants of a 3-month meditation retreat. Now this is pretty significant, a 3-month meditation retreat, right? It's not necessarily our everyday life, but they found that telomerase activity is increased in these participants. So potentially the rate of reduction of these caps at the ends of our chromosomes can be slowed down by some mindfulness practices. And mindfulness can change our gene expression as well. And I'm sure you've heard before, right? Genes are not our destiny, right? So we're born with a certain genetic makeup, and there are very, very few genes that are completely determinant of our health and how they're going to be expressed. But for the most part, there's a gene-environment interaction, right? So if we change our environment, we can change how our genes are expressed. So this study shows that mindfulness practices can actually change gene expression of certain genes that were studied here. And so what they did is these subjects only did 1 day of mindfulness practice versus leisure activities for the control group. And they found that people who did the mindfulness practice, they had a reduced expression of genes implicated in inflammation and stress response. And they also had a faster cortisol recovery. Cortisol is our stress hormone. And it's elevated, obviously, at times of stress when we're fight or flight. And so they had these subjects, these poor subjects, do something called the Trier Social Stress Test, which is a test where people have to basically give a talk on a topic that was just given to them to an audience that is instructed to have a completely kind of blank neutral face and not really approving. And so you can imagine it can be pretty stressful. And so the people that did the mindfulness practice for a day actually had better cortisol recovery. They were like, you know what, this is kind of stressful, but I'm okay. So that's really the goal of mindfulness, right? It's not going to make us completely zen all the time. It's not going to make us, but it's going to make us more resilient to stress. It's going to help us better respond rather than react and get constricted. So what's the summary of evidence for stress? So there's promising evidence of the benefits of mindfulness meditation in depression, anxiety, coping with stress and insomnia, experience of pain, improved eating habits. I didn't share some of these studies because we didn't have time. Neuroplasticity, so the ability of our neurons in our brain to form new connections. Telomerase activity, right, which is associated with longevity, and then gene expression as well. So just a couple of final thoughts. So prevention is key, right? It's so much easier to prevent a disease than it is to treat it. So we don't have to wait for that wake-up call to start to evaluate what's in our environment, what are the triggers, what could have caused it. It is so much easier to take the time to do that now than once we have the disease and we have to deal with complex long cancer treatment or another type of chronic disease. So 5 health habits to reduce our risks of chronic disease. So we talked about mastering stress and having this health mindset and resiliency mindset. We talked about nutrition and our food sourcing as well as food choices. Reducing the toxic burden, whether it's coming from food, from our household, personal care products, or EMFs. And then it's really important to gradually implement these lifestyle habits to support our highest level of health, right? We're not gonna, go home and make changes all at once. And I'm sure many of you, because you're here, you've already made a lot of changes. But it's really important to do this in a way where we're making sustainable changes at a pace that's realistic for us. And then it's really important to work with a qualified healthcare professional, especially in the case of chronic disease, but also in looking at prevention. So we all have the power and the tools to change, right? We just have to use reliable resources. And thankfully, there are more and more resources popping up where we don't have to be our own detectives and trying to figure out everything ourselves. Well, thank you so much.